Welcome back to another MOTOBOB video, and today you join me in the studio for a bit of an exclusive because we've got the Herald Brute 500. Now I believe this is the first time that one's been loaned out to the press or media or social media. We've known it's been coming for a while. I've seen it at a few shows and I think it looks absolutely spectacular, but I'm honored to have first dibs on it. So in this video we'll go through all the specs, I'll give you a proper thorough walk around, and then at the end, for the first time ever, we'll take it for a spin and I'll tell you what it's like on the road. Now I should start by saying that this bike really is a big deal for Herald. Largely up until now they've sustained themselves by importing bikes, giving them their own Herald branding. And yes, they've got some really nice little retro learner bikes in their lineup, but the goal has always been to design and build their own bikes in the UK. Last year I reviewed the Brat 125, a beautiful looking bike, designed here in the UK, but the manufacturing was outsourced overseas. But this, the Brute 500, is designed and a lot of it manufactured at their facility in Cambridgeshire. And where they haven't been able to make stuff, they've tried to source it from UK manufacturers. So when we go through the bike, I'll go through like nose to tail so we don't miss anything, but I'll try and touch upon where things are being built and where things are being bought from. Last thing before we get started, I've got to say this is a pre-production bike. So although it is super close to what they'll actually be producing and selling, some of it is subject to change. Some of the specs, the finishes, things like the throttle map. So let's start down here at the front wheel, and we've got Metzeler Road Tech Z8 tires. So that should tell you a little bit about the road bias of this bike. It does have essentially a dirt bike engine, but they've really spec'd it up to handle. It's actually quite wide as well, 120 mils. So for such a slender bike, it looks pretty fat at the front. And it's wrapped around some of their own Race Tech spoked wheels, 17 inches. Now Race Tech is a sister company to Herald. It's part of a larger engineering company, and they've provided the wheels, the fork, the shock. And so although these are manufactured overseas, they're designed by Race Tech, built to their spec and QC'd by them. Now I believe these wheels are tubeless ready, which is a good thing in my book. At least they've got tubeless tires on them. And then braking, although the caliper has Herald branded on it, actually this is sourced from not Hell, but HEL, which is a UK brake manufacturer. So we've got a big 4-piston radially mounted caliper here, which looks very nice on these wavy discs. And then also the master cylinder, which is span adjustable, is from Hell as well. Moving up the bike, we've got some chunky upside down forks. Like I said, these are from Race Tech as well. There's a little bit of damping adjustment up here. And then these yokes look absolutely stunning, and these are made in-house. CNC'd and then black anodized, and they really do add a classy touch to the front end. Moving up to the cockpit here, you've got an LED light at the front and then some scrolling. Let me show you those. Very nice indeed. Scrolling LED indicators. They've done a great job of keeping this really clean and minimal. There's just a little sort of shroud around the ignition there, but otherwise it looks very clean on the bars. A simple dash from Acewell. I really like the Herald branded surround that they've produced for this. It protects the dash a little bit, but also makes it look that little bit more classy. And then yeah, otherwise it's pretty clean up here. So not much in the way of buttons, just indicators, headlight, horn, starter, kill switch, and that's it. There's no traction control, no riding modes. There's not even ABS. You might have noticed that from looking at the front brake there. There's no ABS track on the disc. They've really tried to keep it super simple, bare bones, and a very pure riding experience. And so each bike has to go through SVA. It's not Euro 5 approved. That means they can do things like not have ABS, and also it's quite loud, the exhaust. You'll know about that when you hear it later when I take it for a spin. One other thing to note up here is the bar position. So they're quite low to the yokes, they're quite flat, but they're super wide. And they say that this is a street tracker. They've tried to give it a bit of that flat track feel, but with proper road focus, suspension and wheels and tires and whatnot. I really like how this bar position feels. I've only done a few short rides to the studio and back, but I'm really looking forward to taking it for a proper good pasting this afternoon. Now, a lot of what I like about this bike is the sort of top line here, the tank, the seat, and this tail section. So the tank is 13.5 litres, which is pretty decent for a bike of this size, and it's one of my favourite features. I love the shape of it, the choice of colour, the graphics on it, and the logo. I think it looks very nice and distinctive. It really flows into this seat, which is super narrow. You can see these lines continue, and then they've got a very nice choice of covering and some blue stitch in here to tie in with the tank graphics. This seat's made in the UK by somebody else for them, and it sits at 835mm high, which should tell you a little bit about the riding position. At the back end, we've got this carbon tail cover, which certainly adds to that sort of tracker feel, and it's got a little pillion seat cover here, so I guess you can have a pillion seat there, and there are bosses here to put hangers for pillion pegs as well, but I probably wouldn't say this is the best choice of pillion bike. A nice neat LED tail light to finish things off at the rear here, and then a fairly slim stalk for the license plate there. Now let me tell you a little bit about the engine. So it's a 450 single and clearly dirt bike derived. It's got a split radiator up at the front here, and they say it's from a leading Asian engine manufacturer, although they didn't specify which. Now in terms of performance figures, it'll do 43 horsepower per 8 or 9,000 RPM, 40 Newton meters of peak torque at about 7. And so although it doesn't sound like masses, you've got to remember that this is a pretty light bike. They're expecting it to finish around 145 or 150 kilograms dry. So power to weight should be decent. Like I say, liquid cooled, 6-speed box, and yeah, I'll tell you more about this when we're on the road, I guess. Now you've also got a decent view of the frame down here, so it's part aluminium, part steel, and these outriggers here and the subframe are all made by Herald in-house. Another thing to note down here is these studded off-road style foot pegs and a grippy rear brake lever, so again, leaning into that sort of tracker feel. Now that sort of leads us back to the swing arm here, which is produced in-house by Herald, and it's linked to a Racetech shock that's got preload and some damping adjustment. Visually, I think the swing arm's actually pretty nice to look at. I like this arm that comes up and connects to the top of the shock there, and then it flows into this plastic hugger, which is produced in the UK by a third party. Now the exhaust system, like I say, it's quite loud and it looks very nice as well. There's a small carbon finisher where it connects here and a carbon finisher at the back that all ties in nicely with the whole back end. And this Herald logo, I think they said this might be subject to change, but it does look very nice on the side of the can there. At the rear, we've got another spoke wheel from Racetech, another 17-incher, a 150 wide Metzler tire, rear brakes from J. Dwan, and then a gold chain, which we all know adds 10 or 15 horsepower. I actually said that in a recent video and someone commented saying, why does the gold chain add 10 horsepower? It doesn't, it's just a joke. So all in all, it's a very special looking bike and something that certainly makes a visual impact. Seeing it up close, the finish is probably not quite at the spec of like a big mainstream manufacturer, but it gives it a bit of a custom feel. I mean, whip the mirrors and the sort of license plate hanger off and it could roll straight out of a custom show. You've got to admire as well where they've built their own bits, things like the yokes and the swing arm and some of these plates. It really just adds up to something that is distinctive. You know, they haven't really bought in parts or used other people's ideas. Anyway, enough about what it looks like. Let's go for a ride.
Now, of course, with a big 450 single like this, it's gonna feel like a dirt bike for the road, kind of like a supermoto, but not as tall in the suspension. Now, it's not loads and loads of power, but I always say with bikes in this sort of 40 to 70 horsepower range that you can have a lot of fun on the road and you can really feel like you're giving them a good scene to, as opposed to riding a super naked at like quarter throttle everywhere. It is going to depend on whether you fundamentally like the sound of a single cylinder engine, but for me, I just love the way it sounds, especially when you're shifting down and decelerating. And it just pops and burbles away. As for the handling, well, the big takeaway for me is just how light and slender it feels, and with these big wide bars you can just absolutely put it wherever you want it. Absolutely perfect for little country lanes, and I bet it'd be a lot of fun in the city as well. Now, perhaps I was expecting a little more initial bite from this front brake, but then again, it not being ridiculously sharp does give you that extra margin for error when it comes to not having ABS. And there is plenty of power when you do properly squeeze it on. The riding position is, well, it feels kind of familiar when you first sit on the bike. At 835mm, that seat height feels like a sporty naked, and it's a nice narrow seat. And the same for the bars, you know, it's something like a street triple really, with that flat low bar that's got decent width to it. Where it surprises me a little is just when you search for the foot pegs when you roll off. My feet are looking for the pegs a little bit further back and up than where they actually are. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. It's a fun riding position, and it does give it its own distinctive character, that street trackerness that they were talking about. Now, with the seat being quite narrow and it's not the most padded either, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's set up for all-day comfort, but the suspension on the other hand, it is a little more cushy than I was expecting, so it's not too bad on rougher surfaces like this. And yeah, I think you could do a decent day's riding without being too sore. It's just the edges of that thin seat that, you know, if you've got a particularly sensitive bum, it might wear a bit thin. I think what I'm taking away most from it though is just the kind of like simplicity and rawness of the riding experience. There's no electronics like I was saying earlier, and so you don't really feel like there's much between you and the engine, and it's a fairly simple engine. Even on slightly damp and gravelly roads like this, you know, you never have TC kicking in and spoiling the fun. And then there's the ABS of course, and it does take a little recalibration if you're used to riding bikes like I am with all the latest and greatest safety features. But it sort of makes me think of the bikes that I used to own that are a lot simpler, and you do feel super connected with the bike, and I think more engaged with the actual riding experience. Now the price will be $6,950 plus on the road charges, and for that sort of money you could possibly get a more mass-produced budget naked, you know, something like an MT-07 or a Trident. Now of course this bike doesn't quite have the same polish, both in terms of the finish and the riding experience. You know, it's vibey, it doesn't have a lot of rider aids. I would say there's not loads of steering lock and little things like that, but what you do get is something that feels really special, really distinctive and a bit more unusual, something a bit more raw, and I think for me a little more exciting to ride.